Jessie Baldwin, Jamie Brown, Moise Roche, and Kirsty Wallis. It's great to have you all here, and thank you for joining us. So the first thing on our agenda is a presentation by Kirsty Wallis from the UCL Office for Open Science and Scholarship. So Kirsty, when you're ready, do say a few words of introduction and kick off with your presentation.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this session today. As Sarah said, I'm Kirsty Wallis and my role here at UCL is as the Head of Research Liaison in Library Services. So this means that I manage a couple of the research support teams, so research data management and bibliometrics. And I also run the day-to-day operations of the UCL Office for Open Science and Scholarship, and I'll come on to what that means in a bit. During this introductory discussion, I'm going to talk in general about open science and the commitment of UCL to support researchers to embrace open science. I'm also going to introduce the 8 pillars that underpin our work and then go on to show you a little bit about where you can get more info. So embracing open science and scholarship in your research, no matter what stage of your academic career you're in, has a number of valuable impacts, and there's a few of them outlined here. Publishing your outputs openly, even just by the simple act of putting it in a repository, maximizes their potential because they can be discovered worldwide, reused and repurposed in novel and innovative ways. And these outputs don't have to be textual either. They can be data sets, transcripts or recordings, software, code, collections of archival or photographs of primary sources, even methodologies or conference materials. If you create it in your research, it can greatly benefit from being made open. Using an open science approach not only makes research more accessible, but it greatly improves transparency of the research process as well, allowing replication and verification of findings. And it opens up possibilities for your work to grow. And it opens the door for collaborations with audiences who may not otherwise get to see it, especially in other parts of the world, such as the Global South. Finally, open science practice opens the academic environment to a much wider audience, including members of the public, not only because they have a stake in a large proportion of the funding that universities receive, but their knowledge and insights can be valuable as active participants in research through citizen science projects. And that's something I'll talk about a little more in a minute. With all this in mind, the UCL launched the Office for Open Science and Scholarship back in October, so we're quite new. And this aims to support the UCL community in the adoption of open practices and approaches, and other things such as communicating between all of the teams involved in supporting research. So whether that is signposting, promoting services, promoting different systems, events, arrange training, and helping to link together researchers with similar interests. Or one of the things that is our long-term goal, which is to build a community of practice around open science. So the 8 pillars of open science represent the broad areas that underpin the work of the office and also open science in general. These come from the recommendations of a document called the LERU Roadmap for Open Science, and this was published back in 2018. So just for a little bit of context, LERU stands for League of European Research Universities, and it consists of leading research universities from across Europe. So UCL is one, there are a couple of others from the UK, but they are spread all across Europe. And I'm just going to run through what the different pillars mean for us. So first up, we have Future of Scholarly Communications. This concept links through to a bunch of the others, but predominantly refers to open publishing and open sharing. So whatever your outputs may be, making them openly available. And this links us on to FAIR data. So FAIR is actually an acronym, and it stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. And this actually refers to outputs in general, as well as data. So the principles behind FAIR combine to lower the point of entry to shared outputs, and it aims to facilitate understanding and proper use of things that are made open. So by making your research outputs fair, you're not only making sure people can find them easily and gain access to them, but you're making sure that people are using them correctly. And also by doing this, you are protecting yourself against your work being misunderstood or inadvertently being misused. Next generation metrics is our next pillar. And this represents work to change the way that metrics, bibliometrics, and citations are used in research. So this refers to when they are used to evaluate quality. So it's trying to move beyond citation counts and journal impact factors to consider how there may be more appropriate uses of a variety of metrics and how metrics can be used to help us gain a broader, fairer understanding of the significance and impact of all research. Rewards and initiatives is next, and this and the next pillar, education and skills, are both very general, so I'm going to talk about them together. So these two cover all of the other pillars and are about ensuring that there's sufficient training, support, and guidance available for everyone to do all of the other things. So this is basically where I come in. It also means that we are working towards developing appropriate reward mechanisms and initiatives for people using open methods rather than the traditional methods. Citizen science is up next, and this is a very broad subject. We have done a webinar on this recently, so if this is something that does interest you, I can recommend direct recording of that for a good overview. There's a link to that at the end of the slides, but in a nutshell, citizen science is the practice of members of the public having a greater role within research. So this can be to the extent of the public being fellow researchers and having an active role in projects. But it can also cover a wide range of other applications, such as crowdsourcing, public engagement initiatives and events, or in-depth community initiatives in local areas. So there are quite a few projects going on in the areas around the university, as well as some internationally. There is a long and growing list on our website of UCL-led citizen science projects. So if you want some examples and some inspiration, I've included a link for that too. So I'm nearly done. There's just two more. So the European Open Science Cloud is a little bit more abstract. So this specifically refers to a Europe-wide project which aims to link together repositories and infrastructure to basically facilitate access and collaboration. The project is ongoing and still developing, so that's kind of a watch this space. But the principle of EOSC also serves to represent the importance of overarching infrastructure that supports open science. So it's a bit of a twofold thing. And finally on the list, we have research integrity. Research integrity underpins all of the other elements, and in some ways it's actually the most important. And so this is why I've saved it until last. So research integrity is the practice of researchers acting honestly, reliably, respectfully, and being accountable for their actions. And this should honestly influence all research behaviour, whether we're talking about pillars or open science or not. If you follow up on anything from today, I would really recommend following the link at the end of the slides and have a look at the resources around research integrity. There's plenty of them. And it's a really good place to start understanding how you can achieve the standards essential for ensuring high quality research. And that is a really good basis for building up to being open. So just to finish before we move on to the discussion, because I'm looking forward to that too. I just wanted to highlight that the Office web pages are where we link to all of the teams, all of the experts, and all of the support content that is across UCL to support all of the areas. Because I know I haven't gone into a lot of detail here today, but if you've got questions or I've made you think or I've raised concerns, everything I mentioned is on that site. We are also quite active on Twitter, so you can get in touch there. You can email me, and we also do blog regularly about various topics across the board. I would absolutely love to hear your questions. If you've got any comments or feedback on the website, on the office, on things that the office can be doing to better support you, please let us know. That would be absolutely fantastic. And just finally to finish, here are the aforementioned resources. We've got the Integrity site, the Citizen Science webinar and website. Sarah has assured me that all of the slides will be being sent round, so don't worry about scribbling them all down. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. That was a great introduction to all the different facets of open science. I think it's really easy to think of open science sometimes as being about open access publication, but of course it's a whole lot more than that, and it's really a whole suite of different approaches that we can use to make science more transparent, more trustworthy, more inclusive, and that includes doing things like sharing data, making science, citizen science projects, those kinds of things. So I'm sure that the audience will have questions about that, and I think we'll come back to those at the end in the Q&A. And for now, I would like to move on to a discussion with our researchers to hear about the work that they've been doing in this space and to get their reflections on open science and how we can be engaging with it. So Jessie, Jamie and Moise, welcome again. And could I start by asking you each to introduce yourself briefly and just say who you are and what your research focuses on as a brief background.
Okay, so I'll start. I'm Jessie Baldwin. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Clinical, Educational and Health Psychology. And my research focuses on childhood adversity and mental health. And I've also been quite involved in reproducibility initiatives. So I co-run the Reproducibility Journal Club at UCL, which I'd really encourage all of you to attend, even if I'm not sure, even if you're not students at UCL, we're doing it online, so everyone's welcome. And I'm the local lead for the UK Reproducibility Network for UCL too.
Hi, I'm Jamie Brown. I'm a Professor of Behavioural Science and Health and Director of the UCL Tobacco and Alcohol Research Group. Our research is principally interested in evaluating the effects of treatments and policies on smoking cessation and alcohol reduction. We do that both at kind of the individual level, so thinking about things like apps and medications, and evaluating them in clinical trials, and also at the population level and looking at things like the impacts of mass media campaigns on smoking prevalence at the population level. I don't really consider myself an expert in open science, but I've been enthusiastic and trying to apply it to my work since about 2013, which is when I first heard about it.
Great, and Moise?
Oh, hello, I'm Moise. Just completing my PhD within UCL Division of Psychiatry. So my work is looking at how, the sort of relationship between ethnicity and dementia. So we do have a lot of information out there, and there's a sort of a narrative going out, around. So the idea was to see whether this is actually correct, and how we can help, particularly people from Black ethnicity, to deal with dementia. My sort of link to open science was quite inadvertently, because I was doing it without even realizing I was doing it. But I believe that's a very good approach. So obviously we'll be talking about it a little bit more.
Thank you, everybody. So the first question that I'd like to ask each of you is, what open science practices have you been engaging in? So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in this space. Should we go in the same order?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that I started to do, which is quite an easy step, was to make my code available. Because I work on large observational data sets, often there's ethical restrictions, so we can't always share that data. But what we can easily do is to share our code. So I actually, you don't need to use any kind of fancy programming software to do that. But there are ones that can kind of help and make it look like really pretty. So I I started to learn R Markdown, which is a way to kind of make your R scripts look really nice and really easy to follow. So that was the first thing I started to do. And there are lots of kind of courses that UCL run and that are online about how to kind of use R Markdown. But as I said, you can just share like a status script or SPSS or R. It doesn't have to be with a fancy software. And then the next things that I started to do were pre-registering studies. So for example, you can pre-register on a website called the Open Science Framework. And pre-registration is basically where you post your kind of protocol for your research, specify the methods that you're going to use, your hypotheses and research questions, and you post this on an open repository before you've started the study. And that kind of helps to protect against some of the things that we would call questionable research practices, like p hacking, which is when you kind of run many different tests and then only report the ones that are statistically significant. And pre-registration can reduce the kind of ability to do things like p hacking because you've already pre-specified all of your methods in advance. And then I guess the most recent thing that I've been doing is a registered report, which is kind of an extension of pre-registration, because it's when you basically you submit your protocol or your pre-registration for a study, you submit that to a journal, and that gets peer reviewed by other academics, and it's kind of judged for the importance of the research question and also the strength of the methods that you've proposed to use. And then after that gets peer reviewed, I actually had a few rounds of revisions, but then eventually it was accepted in principle, which is really nice because it means that I can now go and do the study and it should be accepted regardless of the results, as long as I don't kind of veer off the methods that I said that I was going to use. So yeah, that's something that I'm really enthusiastic about, and I'm happy to answer any more questions if you have it on registered reports.
Great. And Jamie?
Hi, thanks. There's quite a lot of overlap, unsurprisingly. But yeah, in concrete terms, I suppose what we're doing regularly as a research group that I regard as open science, we spend a long time working on protocols, but either before collecting the data or in the case of secondary analysis before looking at the data. And then, as Jessie said, we then pre-register those data analysis plans. We also use Open Science Framework. It's a very useful repository, quite well organised, and allows you to link different parts of the project that you might want to share. So also, you know, in my area, you know, into materials that relate to the intervention. So, you know, what sort of things you're telling people to do, or in the case of digital interventions, maybe some open sourced software code and so on, and you can have it all in one place. So yeah, I think pre-registration of our work is the most important thing we do, and I think it's made the biggest difference to our work. When we publish, we've recently moved to aiming to share the work on a preprint server. We only really probably started doing that during the pandemic, and I think we might come to kind of challenges, benefits a bit later, but I can talk about why we kind of changed our minds about preprint servers. But that involves uploading your manuscript at the same time you seek to submit it to a journal, so people can review the manuscript as soon as it's ready, and you can start getting feedback from the wider community and so on, in parallel to it being formally peer reviewed at a journal. Like Jessie said, we also seek to share our data wherever it's possible, and also our code and syntax. And then beyond my immediate research group, I'm a deputy regional editor at the Journal of Addiction, and I seek to influence editorial policy as it relates to open science. And I couldn't take credit for the policy itself, but I think I'm part of the wider conversation. Editorial board. We now, the journal requires everyone who submits their paper to report whether or not the analyses were pre-registered. They still accept papers that were unregistered, but it just requires a statement as to whether or not they were pre-registered, which I think is very helpful. And yeah, I think we've engaged with registered reports once or twice, but that's something we'd like to do a bit more of in the future. And actually, I know Marcus Manafo, who's a big open science advocate, and he's also a smoking researcher, so I work quite closely with him. He's been involved in an extension of that registered reports initiative, which is actually to link the journal for which he's an editor, Nicotine and Tobacco Research, to Cancer Research UK. So at the stage of funding, where you get lots of reviews on the funding proposal and the protocol and the design, you can link for the study at funding stage to ultimately be published in the journal. So you go right from kind of funding and conception through to ultimate publication.
That's great, thank you. And Moise, tell us about what you've been doing.
So for me, what I've been doing, as Jamie was saying, it's quite a lot of overlap. So to make your study available, or at least your protocol available beforehand. Personally, I tend to do that, sort of information or feedback from the public to see whether this will be a very applicable, an applied sort of result or applicable for them, relevant to them. So usually quite good to get that kind of information because it helps you with the design of your study. Now, now it's quite interesting because the methodology I've been using quite a lot at the moment, it's a qualitative search. And what I've sort of been doing lately is to make my my data available, not simply through the publication study, but when the study is actually published, I also publish the interviews. Obviously, you know, I anonymize those and make them, you know, so that no one can be recognized. But then I think the publishing, you know, in interviews, transcripts that help people see where how you got to that, you know, to the findings that you published. Another thing as well, it's I usually try to make all my publication open access. Sometimes they can be quite expensive, but then I think it's a very good idea to do so. And the sort of things that I did was to generate some results to the participants who've, you know, taken part in the research. The one thing that people tend to tell me is that usually participate in research, but do not actually see the results. Even if it, you know, even though you publish these on journal and, you know, peer-reviewed journal, they don't get access. What I tended to do is send them the output of my research. So I can sort of see that something happened from, you know, their participation in that, you know.
That's great. Thank you, Moise. And I think it's really interesting that you, as a qualitative researcher, have made your data available and you published the transcripts of interviews and focus groups, because I think that's quite rare, you know, because it can potentially be identifiable and things. So it'd be great to come back to that. Just to say, you're breaking up slightly, so I'm not sure if it would be good to put your camera off or if you could come a bit closer to the screen or something so that we can hear you a bit clearer. Thank you.
My camera off, so that should be good.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was your thoughts on why open science is important and why should we be engaging with this? It would be great to hear what motivated you as well to get involved. So shall we go round again?
Sounds good. Also, I just wanted to highlight one point I missed from the last answer about open science practices. So something that I'd recommend doing, which is super easy, is to use reporting checklists too. So these are things that basically have different criteria for different parts of the way you've reported the methods and the results, and like even the introduction and discussion on your study, to make sure that you're transparently reporting things. So for example, in observational studies, there's one called Strobe Checklist, and it's quite a useful thing to go through either while you're writing or even at the end before you're about to submit, to just check that you have been transparent in every aspect. And it also looks good on your papers too, if you can show that you can just put a sentence in saying you've conformed to the reporting guidelines. And in terms of why it's important for early career researchers, I have loads of reasons, so I'll try and be quick. So I think it's great to kind of establish good practice early on. So to start doing these things as soon as you can, because it will mean that you kind of get into the habit of pre-registering, making things available, and just thinking about how to be as open and transparent as possible. And I think during the PhD is like a great time for training and learning new things. So it's a good time to invest to kind of learn these skills. I also think that just generally it increases the rigor of your research and makes it more reproducible. So you'll be doing better quality research from the beginning, which I think as like researchers, that's what we all want to do, to make sure that the research we're doing is really good. Also, it can increase the credibility of your research. So, for example, lots of journals award badges for open science practices. So if you've, say, pre-registered, you get a badge linked to your article showing that, or if you've made your code available. And so that kind of increases credibility. And also open science practices are often now used in hiring criteria for postdoctoral positions and even for promotions within universities. Finally, 2 more points. I think it's also a really supportive community to become involved with. Lots of early career researchers and more senior people are really passionate about this, and people are all really supportive, and it can make you feel as though you've got like a nice network of supportive people around you, even if it's just through Twitter. And finally, I think it can help you save time too, because although you might think, oh, I have to spend the time learning how to do all these things, there are also payoffs in doing things like, for example, if you pre-register an analysis plan before you've started the study, then you can't be asked to run loads more analyses by your supervisor, because you can say, well, we've pre-registered, we have to stick to this. Or even from reviewers, you've got a very good reason to stick to your original plan. And I think there's lots of other examples of how these practices can help save time in the long run. But I won't talk anymore. I'll hand over to Jamie now. Great,
thanks, Jessie. You've hit a lot of what I was going to say again. But yeah, I think the most important reason, I think there are lots of others, but I think the most important is there's kind of good reason to believe, as you said, it will produce better quality and more reproducible science, which is fundamentally why most of us are in this field. I think, I mean, it's certainly not really for the salary or the job security. So yeah, I think that's important, and it's worth bearing in mind. Kind of open science is quite hard to pin down, and it's kind of arguably a movement, but it's certainly very closely linked with that wider movement to improve reproducibility, which was born out of people debate whether crisis is quite the right word, but the replicability crisis and the extent to which, you know, science was reproducible and trustworthy. So yeah, I think that's the fundamental reason, but then there are lots of other kind of benefits as a consequence, which a lot of which Jessie covered. There's one thing that Marcus says, or maybe he takes it from someone else himself, but I've heard Marcus saying is that quite often earlier on in your career, you might not realize it, but your key collaborator will be your future self or your past self 10 years ago. So, by doing all this pre-registration, annotating your code, sharing things, you'll very much be able to keep track of your own research very efficiently. And when you come to do similar things again in the future, or need to revisit analyses or pieces of work, it's made so much easier by having kind of approached the science in this way. Having studied for my PhD at a time before probably engaging in some of these practices, I can definitely attest to it being much easier to deal with my later work since we started engaging in these sorts of practices. And I think, you made the point about kind of some benefits, and I think that's worth reiterating. I do think it is the future, and increasingly people are kind of taking it up. So I think having an interest and skill set in kind of open science practices will look good on job applications. It's something we have down as a criteria for positions in our research group now, and I think increasingly research groups do, and I think they're also good markers of research groups you might want to work in. Funders increasingly ask for sections in your kind of data management section about how you'll make your data accessible and what other kind of open science practices you'll engage in. I think some journals, but I think it'll be a trickle, and it will increasingly change kind of requiring it. As I mentioned, Addiction has that policy on you have to say whether or not it's pre-registered. Quite a lot of journals require you to deposit the data on which your paper is the data on which your paper is based, and likewise the code in some places, and promotions. And that final point about it's a very supportive community, but one to emphasize is that it's a really interdisciplinary community as well. So it can really help you kind of move beyond your traditional field boundaries to make some connections with people, very good scientists in slightly different areas, and that can often be very useful for kind of triggering new bits of science, new thought processes, and so on. Thanks.
That's great. Moise, would you like to say a bit about your thoughts on the importance of using open science approaches?
Yes, so pretty much agree with Jessie and Jamie. One thing I'll probably just add, for me, I think it is also like a good channel of verification of your finding, particularly for qualitative research. We know there's a lot of data, and usually the interpretation of the data can change depending on the researcher. And I think in my field, particularly in looking at dementia within the ethnicity sort of area, the interpretation can change a lot depending on the researcher ethnicity, background, and knowledge with the group. So publishing your data can help another researcher check that, where you got that actual findings, what sort of led to that, whether the majority of people sort of use the same narrative as you, or whether that was something that sort of struck you as important and that was said by one person. So I think it helps with transparency, but also helps with making sure that your information, what you publish, is representative of the group you are searching.
That's so interesting, and great also that you kind of see that as a benefit in terms of kind of double checking your interpretation, because I've certainly heard critiques of sharing qualitative research and people thinking, oh, another researcher won't understand the data that I've collected, they don't understand the context in which this was developed. So it's really interesting that that's your view on it, and really great to hear. So I think actually a lot of you have touched on the benefits of open science in the discussion that we've just had. And so I thought maybe now we could move on to what are the challenges in making our research open. So are there any risks? Are there any disadvantages? Are there any concerns that you might have about it? Anything like that?
So I guess there are a few potential concerns. So it can sometimes be time consuming in order to kind of spend time formatting scripts to make sure that it's clear and things, or writing a pre-registration rather than just diving in and start analysing the data. But usually these things do save time in the long run. Like Jamie was saying, like if you've spent the time formatting your script and making sure it's clear in the first place, you probably are going to have to refer to that at some point in the future, or maybe share it with someone else you're working with. And so it will save you time to then have to go back to it and be like, what was I doing? Because it will be so clear. Also, I think when people share data and their code, there is a worry, like if there's a mistake, then people will spot it, and that's obviously a bit intimidating. But I think that, well, for the sake of science, it's probably always good that these things are like made public. And also, I think just by posting, by making things available, you're more likely to go through it very carefully and check it, or maybe ask someone else to check it. And I think more and more people are accepting that making mistakes is just a part of the process, and there have been quite a lot of retractions when this kind of thing has happened, and actually the researchers who that's happened to have been praised for kind of being so open and honest, and people have acknowledged that even though this might be the worst case scenario, it's actually not that bad, and it's quite honourable of people to make that open and to share that. And other things, so I think sometimes it might be hard to persuade your supervisor to get on board with open science practices, so that might be a bit of a challenge. And I would say that if that is a concern, then one probably quite savvy thing to do would be to highlight all of the kind of selfish reasons for engaging in open science. So how that could lead to kind of extra credit at journals or with reviewers, and things like that. So to emphasize more how it would benefit like your supervisor and your research, rather than because it's like an honourable thing to do. But I guess it totally depends on your supervisor. And also, just one other point, it's not always feasible to share some data, like if there are ethical restrictions, but I think no one is expecting that to happen if there are ethical restrictions, so that's not really an issue that I've come across.
Thanks, Jessie. Completely agree with what you've said again. I think that kind of perception of that switching to this slightly different way of working, requiring a bit more upfront effort, can definitely be a challenge. But as you say, I think knowing that kind of transparency is on the work, and also feedback you get on it and all the other benefits we've talked about, I think probably is more than makes up for that kind of trade-off. I think thinking back to when we were first having kind of seminars about it and the extent to which we were going to try and do it more routinely, I think some people might feel slightly kind of proprietorial about data sets and codes that they've worked very hard on, invested a lot of time and energy and effort, and there's a sense in which kind of scientists feel in competition with each other for funding and for jobs. And so I don't think that's easy, and I think fundamentally that's a problem to kind of solve more for kind of infrastructure and institutions, and we've talked about some of those things in terms of funders valuing kind of reproducible practices and employers valuing those sorts of metrics instead. But obviously that's for kind of the medium to long term rather than an individual thinking about a decision. But just to emphasize, I think, you know, those benefits we've talked about probably outweigh that when you actually do it in practice, sharing those data and those code, and you don't suddenly see people kind of scooping you. And what instead happens is that people are very keen on collaborating, and they may offer some useful feedback, or they'll say, look, this is really interesting, can we work on something together? And actually that collaboration kind of builds your capacity for doing more research. So I think it fosters more collaboration rather than competition. It takes some of the sting out of that. And as I say, hopefully there'll be in that medium term a kind of change from funders and employers and so on. I think two other areas are, as I mentioned, we were a bit more hesitant about preprints for quite a long time, and I think some of that is because of the area we work in. It's with smoking cessation things, and particularly relating to e-cigarettes, there can be a lot of interest in it from the press, and increasingly, I think press kind of scan preprint servers and are looking for kind of news stories, and we were feeling a little bit less comfortable about things being reported as, you know, established science when they were, you know, still being subject to peer review and so on. And I don't think I've kind of completely resolved that. I think, you know, we don't press release anything put on preprint servers, for example, so we don't seek it. You can't remove the possibility that it'll be found. But I think we just came to the view in the pandemic, because we were publishing things related to COVID, that was really important to share with kind of key policymakers and other scientists, that those benefits just outweighed those kind of smaller risks. And one other point, and I think it will come up for people, is quite often the principle is fine, but then there's specific instances where, you know, you might need to be a bit more nuanced. And again, in my area, there's a very large national survey we collect, where we survey about 1,700 people each month, answering loads of questions on smoking. We've got kind of data from more than 300,000 people now, going back to 2006. And we don't share that whole data set routinely on a repository because of concerns about the tobacco industry, essentially. And they've kind of got hold of certain parts and publish things to kind of muddy the science and so on. But what we do is we share specific data sets as they relate to any given paper we publish. So I think you can kind of find nuanced parts. So and the thinking there is that if it's a data set relating to a specific research question, it's much easier to kind of rebut anything specifically tobacco industry might use and then come back at you on, and it doesn't create that much more work. Whereas if that's that whole thing in directions we haven't, it can really stretch our capacity. But yeah, the point is about nuance, I suppose. Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear about press interest and commercial interest as well. I hadn't considered that. Yeah, really interesting. Moise, would you like to say a little bit about the challenges that you've experienced in doing open science before we move on to the Q&A?
Yes, actually, I think my answer will probably provide an answer to some of the questions. One of the biggest challenge, obviously, for qualitative research, you know, thinking about releasing someone's interview transcript will be, there's a problem with ethical issue there and confidentiality, because you potentially will be releasing information that is recognizable. Of course, it depends on what your ethic approval has been presented as. For example, in the research where I presented or released all my interviews, I did not say that the data will be kept simply between me and the research team. Now, if you do say that the data would only be looked at by the research team, that would cause some issue. So you probably have to think about that in advance, whether you want to release that data, and discuss it with participants. Now, in that research, we did say to participants, any information released about you would be unrecognizable and will be anonymized. So obviously that takes a little bit of work to go through the entire transcript, not only removing all names and all organizations, names of organization or names of areas in UK, or name of all relative mentions, to make it as unrecognizable as possible before releasing that information. Yeah, so that for me, that's the biggest challenge, really, releasing information. That may be because this is actually a full transcript about someone talking about their lives. So it's a little bit tricky.
Yeah, quite personal, isn't it? And definitely needing consent for that to happen. That was really interesting, all of you. So we have 10 minutes now for questions from the audience, and I'm going to call on my co-host Sylvie, who's been keeping an eye on the chat, to say if there's any questions that have come up.
Thanks very much.
Call on people.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much to the panel. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. There's a brief question here from Kirsty just about how many of the panel members have used open publications, data or code within your research so far. I don't know, Kirsty, if you'd like to expand on that.
No, I was just curious because we talk a lot about making work open. I was curious about how the panelists are using data that may have been made open by other people.
Because of the ethical restrictions and the data sets that I work on, I haven't been able to make data available, but I've made code available and try to publish open access and do preprints too.
I think, were you asking about I beg your pardon, sorry, Jamie.
No.
Were you asking about using other researchers' data? Sorry. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I personally haven't had to use other researchers' data. People have asked me for my data, probably because of the field, which I have sort of sent to them. But I haven't had to do that other than, for example, my last review, I did contact researchers to ask them their ethnicity and the co-authors. And so, interestingly enough, requesting that type of data from researchers wasn't very popular, so I didn't get that many answers. But I used another method to sort of determine their ethnicity. But I suppose the problem is, I think there's a little issue if you don't want to give some information. People tend not to, if they're not open to open science, they may not be open to provide some information from them or their data to you either.
I think it's a really interesting question though, and it's something that I've been thinking about more recently because of being in COVID times when lots of us haven't been able to collect the data that we might need, and maybe this is a way that we can source other data to answer our research questions. Then there's the question of how reusable is it, and can you repurpose data to answer different questions? So it's an interesting one. Jamie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'll answer very brief so we can get some more questions. But yes, people have certainly used data that we've shared openly in order to kind of collaborate on publications that we otherwise wouldn't have done. And I have used open data in the sense that we didn't collect, but it was more kind of secondary data analysis from kind of central sources as opposed to a repository from ONS, so from ONS or ISRIC or things like that.
Great, thank you. Ruth and Lizzie, I don't know if the questions that you asked were answered, or if either of you wanted to expand on specifically this question around tools for sharing qualitative data, specifically where, yeah, I just wanted to check that that had been answered, or if you would like to expand on it or ask anything further.
No, I was just wondering whether they used Open Science Framework for sharing qualitative results as well, yeah, or whether there was some other platform potentially to use.
Well, for me, when I published the data, it was through the journal, but also through UCL Discovery. I always forget the name.
Yeah.
UCL has an option to release your paper, but also your data if you want. So there's a UCL Discovery. There's a word after that. I'm not quite sure what it is. But it was both through UCL and through the journal. So the journal, if they do have the space or the option to provide further information, they're quite happy to receive that information.
Great, thank you.
Maybe it's something I should do after this event is actually just send around some links of sources of data if people want to get hold of it. So if you know of any sources of open data, do send it to me and I'll collate it and send it out to everybody.
There is a blog post on the Open Science blog about finding and using open sources. I will find it and post it in the chat.
Thank you.
So much, Kirsty. There's a question here from Sophia, which I'll read out, but Sophia, please do jump in and ask Jessie directly if you'd like to expand on it. So there was a term, Jessie, that you used for the selection inclusion of data, wherein only the data that leans towards one result is used. Potentially, if this completely alters what the research outcome might be, why do researchers do it when it renders their research results invalid anyway?
Question. So I guess there's maybe two terms. So one is p-hacking, which is when you kind of might run loads of different tests and then only report the statistically significant ones. Another term that's often used is selective reporting, which is kind of a similar thing, but when you only report the results that are either significant or maybe novel or surprising in some way, and you kind of leave out other analyses that you've done. And in terms of why people do it, the sad truth is that there are lots of incentives to do it currently. So especially with journals, papers are more likely to be published if you have a significant or a novel or surprising result. And I've definitely experienced this myself, like being rejected from journals because the results show small effect sizes or confounding or something that's not very punchy and doesn't make a great kind of story or a big new finding. And also significant papers that have significant results are also more likely to be cited too than negative results. I think these things are really starting to change, and hopefully in the next 10 years or so, this won't be the case so much. But definitely in the past, researchers have really been incentivized to only report like significant findings, even though that's not the full picture at all.
Can I just add something to that as well? Completely agree with what you say, Jessie, and it's also worth just pointing out, it was kind of implicit what you said, but obviously scientists are human and we're all subject to these biases and so on that, you know, the field of psychology has taught us all about. So, you know, you have on the one hand, which some people imagine, you know, kind of outright fraud and people behaving, you know, very appallingly, but then a lot of kind of practices that are, you know, not best practice and quite often are being done because people haven't been trained otherwise, and involve things like confirmation bias, and you know, it can be a real problem and you need to distinguish very clearly. But I think, you know, on that other side, if you do things like we're talking about, we're pre-registering, and it becomes a very different thing for a researcher to actively you know, misreport compared with the pre-registered plan, as that's becoming lying, as opposed to if someone's just playing around with an analysis, they run something and they go, oh no, I didn't mean to do that. Kind of psychologically, I think they separate the things much more clearly. And I think also a point that's sometimes missed is it's not always the case that, you know, it's not saying you can't do exploratory data analysis. People understand that that is an important part of science, and in Marcus and other people's manifesto for reproducible science, you know, recognizing a hallmark of scientific creativity is to see novel and unexpected patterns in data. But the key point is to, where it is kind of exploratory, it's generating hypotheses for then other people to pre-register and test a priori, as opposed to, which is another term sometimes used, harking, which is you then present that as if you always had that research question and that idea in mind, and this was identified having kind of pre-registered a hypothesis, which, you know, completely changes the interpretation of the result and the extent to which people think it needs to be replicated and reproduced. So I think it's worth being quite clear about those two different practices. I'll put a link in the chat to that manifesto, which I think is great, actually.
Thank you.
Oh, very helpful.
I'm afraid we've come to 3 p.m, so we will have to draw the discussions to a close. But thank you so much to all of our speakers who have taken the time to be here today and share your experience with us. And thank you to everybody that's asked questions as well. I've certainly learned lots, and I'm going to go away and think about what I can do to make my own research more open and engage in some of these practices. And I hope you will as well. Look out for an email from me. I will send around some more information and resources. And do feel free to get in touch and let us know if you'd like to, what other subjects you'd like to see covered in these seminars. So I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody.